we will only be here briefly, but I watched the most recent interview of Sam Harris, and he once again makes all of the same, what I would say are decidedly wrong points, but the point that in the case that 97%, I think is the number he uses, of your experts agree and 3% disagree, that yes, of course, it's always possible that the non-experts are right, but you should go with the 97% of the experts each and every time, because you're much more likely to be correct in your thinking. And so that's obviously nuts, or I should say the fact is obviously nuts, but why it's nuts isn't so obvious. And I thought it was worth us exploring that a little bit. So first of all, let me just recall something that we've talked about here before, which is that it is if the return on investment for betting against the fringe is pretty reliable, right? In general, the fringe isn't right, and even when it is right, it's that something within the fringe is right, while the majority of the fringe remains wrong, right? The fringeness of the fringe is in and of itself reason to just be a little skeptical. That's certainly true. But what Sam's assertion does not take into account is the disproportionate benefit of knowing when something on the fringe is actually right, in spite of the belief of 97% or 99% or effectively 100% of the experts, right? In those cases where the experts have it wrong, the profit to be made is huge. That's one thing. But the other thing is there's a question about what that 97% even is, right? Under normal circumstances, if everybody was perfectly free to believe whatever they wanted, and the experts were having vigorous discussions in which they were pushing each other around and had arrived somewhere naturally, then that's not perfect evidence that they've got it right, but it's at least something. But we don't live in a normal era. And this is really, I think, what's driving Sam mad in front of our eyes, is that he is applying rules from some other time and place as if they are universal, and they are far from universal. So what I thought was that it was worth laying out a kind of taxonomy of narrative brokenness, right? And looking at what underlies the differences between times and places, and what we ought to put, how much stock we ought to put in the belief of so-called experts. So I think everybody realizes that we have a degree of corruption. Sam would acknowledge, and in fact, he repeatedly does acknowledge, that there is corruption in our institutions, and that that's a problem. But the problem is that the word corruption itself suggests that it is the minor force, right? If we say that, you have an SD card and it's corrupted, we're not saying that most of what's on the SD card is wrong. We're saying that there is a small disruption somewhere, right? And that small disruption may be enough to prevent your camera from reading it, right? Or it may distort a photograph, or, photograph may not be viewable. But the point is, the corruption is the minor part. And the question is, are there things that would cause the distortion to be the major part? So, okay, corruption is like, well, let's try this. In the case that the interests of some entity that could corrupt the system are aligned with the interests of the public. In other words, if you have a democracy where the interests of the public are supposed to guide, and you have some corporation and it wants something done that would actually be good for the public, there's no problem. It doesn't really have to do anything. It can just make the argument, and the public, seeing its own interest, will be in support of the thing that works for the corporation. What that means is that the efforts that these corporations deploy, the expensive efforts like lobbying, for example, those efforts will be in places where their interests diverge from the public. right? It will corrupt the government, not where it doesn't need to do that. It will corrupt the government where it wants the government not to do the government's job, serving the public, but instead to serve the corporate needs. And so it will disguise those things as if they are in the interest of the public.
I'm going to steel man just one piece of this,
Sure.
which is that lobbying could be simply about getting the word out. So even under circumstances where all the interests align, which will be somewhat rare, you might still have things like promotion, marketing, advertisement, lobbying in order to spread the good word, frankly.
I agree at a technical level. Mm-hmm. The problem with that, I mean, you've said you're steel manning it, so I know you're not advocating this as a major countervailing force. But the problem is it doesn't take almost anything to spread the word if it's in the interest of people to hear the word, right? If you're a representative in Congress and there's some piece of legislation that would be beneficial to both your constituents and to some power player, then it doesn't take very much to get that in front of you because, hey, it's a win for you. Even cynically, it's a win for you to advance the cause. You'll make yourself more likely to be reelected. You'll have greater power, etc. And so likewise, you can say, look, there are two reasons for advertising to exist. Advertising exists to manipulate people into doing things that they wouldn't otherwise do, spending money they wouldn't otherwise spend, or choosing this thing over that thing. And you could say, well, part of advertising is just getting information out. Right. And the answer is, yep, but sit in front of your TV sometime and figure out what percentage of each ad is actually about information and what percentage is about manipulation, and you'll realize, oh my goodness, the lion's share of this thing is absolutely about manipulating people, and the information, sort of squeaks in there every now and again. So I think it's like that. Mm-hmm. It's not that there's no, a lobbyist could potentially just alert a lawmaker this thing is possible and might be good. But more or less what they do, really, the reason they're paid the big bucks is to pretend that that's what they're doing, while in fact they are incentivizing and manipulating and lying and all of the things that they're so good at. But okay, we got corruption, right? Corruption takes a system that is supposed to be rigged around the interests of the population, and it distorts it, right? A little bit. Then we have the next piece of this taxonomy, which is capture. Right? Now, capture, I want to be careful. Capture is a term that often comes with another term, regulatory capture, right? Now, in my opinion, that's too narrow. Regulatory capture is real, and that means that an industry or a company has gotten control over some entity that is supposed to be controlling it, right? When a pharma company gets control of the FDA, right, that's the tail wagging the dog. The FDA is supposed to be protecting us from pharma. It is supposed to be exerting control over them, and the reverse has happened. So that's regulatory capture. But what we are seeing is something much broader than that, right? Because a lot of the things that have been captured aren't regulatory, right? So anyway, when corruption is the minor force, corruption is the right term. Capture is when some entity within the system, some institution or process, has been taken over by something that is supposed to be subservient to it, right? And then there's this next phase where it's not even that the FDA has been captured by pharma, but it is actually a whole network of institutions that then have an emergent nature, right? The FDA has been captured, and the FDA may grant emergency use authorization where it shouldn't. It may participate in silencing critics, right? It may participate in obscuring harms, these kinds of things. These are terrible in and of themselves. But then you find, the New York Times playing wingman.
Yes, you do.
Right? And so this is like a whole next level. Not only are we dealing, so corruption is the minor version, where the major version is still doing what the system is designed to do, but it has been redirected to a small extent. You've got capture, where entire institutions have been inverted, and they are doing the inverse job. They are working for those they are supposed to be regulating and regulating those they are supposed to be working for. And then you have this next level thing, which is the emergence of a network of institutions that are captured by one mechanism or another. And what it results is in an entire false narrative about where we are, what we face, what the experts believe, which is really the place where the analysis that says, hey, let's go with the experts, that usually works, right? We don't know what the experts believe. Because as you and I keep discovering, every time you have a conversation where you confess your actual beliefs on these things, you find that people don't hold the beliefs that they have been espousing, right? They, to one degree or another, have private suspicions that they haven't been sharing, things that they would get punished if they said them out loud. Mm-hmm. And so, we are living in a hall of mirrors that goes even beyond a world where you imagine regulatory capture has happened, right? Yep. Why is the New York Times participating in the same story that the captured FDA is advancing, right? How did that happen? How is there no possibility of real journalism? How does it have to happen in a tweet thread or on Substack, right? Rather than in the New York Times and the Washington Post and, the New York Post or whatever other papers. I guess the New York Post has done a certain amount, but it's also been silenced for doing it. Mm-hmm. All right, so that's the general taxonomy.
Maybe, the militant moderate writes, Sam Harris would respond favorably to a steel man off, an initial conversation to simply nail down what each of you thinks, then another conversation a week or two later.
I mean, I've offered the man a bunch of different mechanisms to deal with this. I don't think he could possibly have a structural objection because the structure is open. I think the problem is he is beginning to detect just how his heuristic led him into terrible danger, and he's having trouble, if you're Sam Harris and you believe all the things that he keeps saying about the importance of the institutions and the discovery that the institutions have completely collapsed, that they are effectively like the rabid dog, is a terrifying realization. And I don't disagree that it's terrifying. Mm-hmm. But I've been trying to tell people for decades that that's where we were headed. And so this isn't new to me. I'm less terrified because I've gone through the horrifying thought experiment of what are we going to do if these institutions stop working, right? So I think he's just getting used to the idea. And anyway.
You see some evidence that he's getting used to the idea?
I think the level at which he has ended up wrong over the pandemic is going to force him to realize that some fundamental assumption has to be off. And he's going to discover that the fundamental assumption is that there's such a thing as experts and that they work in institutions and that those institutions are, more right than they are wrong. And the answer is no, they're more Pfizer than they are reality, and Pfizer isn't your friend,
Yeah. It seems like a lot of assumptions, though. It's a big house of cards.
The man's got himself a house of cards built on sand, and it ain't going to last, especially with the coming storm. So, I don't know how many analogies we have to throw in there to wake him up, but Sam, it's time.